I found the letters hidden in a velvet box beneath his bed the night before our wedding, and every word upon those pages was addressed to another woman. 5 years of longing, 5 years of confession, 5 years of a love so tender it made my own heart ache with jealousy for a stranger I had never met. My name is Vivian Ashworth, and before I became the woman standing in that cold bedchamber with trembling hands and tear-blurred eyes, I was a queen, a widow, a sovereign of a kingdom that had spent 2 decades at war with the very nation whose most powerful duke I was now promised to marry. But I am telling this story out of order, and if you are to understand how I came to love the man who wrote those letters, and how he came to discover that the stranger he adored was the enemy queen he was sworn to despise, I must begin at the true beginning. I must begin with the first letter. It arrived on a winter morning in the year 1842, addressed to a Miss Sophia Wren at Hartwell Cottage. I was not Miss Sophia Wren. I was Her Majesty Queen Vivian of Aldoria, recently widowed at the age of 23, ruling a small but proud kingdom nestled between mountain ranges and bordered by the vast empire of Ashford to the east. But in those dark months following my husband's death, I had fled the palace for a cottage in the countryside, seeking solitude and silence, desperate to escape the weight of a crown I had never wanted. Hartwell Cottage had once belonged to a woman named Sophia Wren, a spinster who had died years before I was born. The villagers still called it by her name, and when the letter arrived bearing that address, the postman simply left it upon my doorstep without question. He was an elderly man named Thomas, kind and unassuming, who delivered mail to all the scattered homes in that remote valley. He did not know that the quiet woman in mourning black who had taken up residence in the old cottage was his sovereign. He did not know that the letters he would deliver over the coming years would change the course of 2 nations. I should have returned it. I should have written a note explaining the error and sent it back to wherever it had come. But the envelope was so elegant, the handwriting so refined, and I was so terribly lonely that I opened it instead. The loneliness was a living thing in those days, a presence that filled every room I entered, that sat beside me at meals, that whispered to me in the long hours of sleepless nights. My husband, King Aldrich, had been a good man, but not a passionate one. Our marriage had been arranged when I was 17, a political alliance between his kingdom and my father's duchy. He had been kind to me, respectful, considerate of my comfort and my opinions. But there had been no fire between us, no consuming love, only a gentle companionship that, while pleasant, had left something essential in my heart unfed. When he died of a fever in the autumn of 1841, I mourned him sincerely. I mourned the loss of a friend, a partner, a man who had never treated me with anything but courtesy. But I did not mourn as a woman mourns her great love. I mourned as one mourns the death of possibility, the closing of a door that had never quite opened. The ministers expected me to remain at the palace. They expected me to take up the reins of government immediately, to oversee the continued prosecution of the war with Ashford, to be the symbol of stability and strength that my people needed. But I could not yet. I needed time to breathe, time to think, time to remember who I was beneath the crown and the mourning veils. So I fled to Hartwell Cottage, a property that had come to the crown through some long-forgotten bequest, and I told my ministers I would be in mourning for 3 months. They protested, but I was the queen, and in the end they had no choice but to acquiesce. I took only 2 servants with me, an elderly couple named Margaret and William who had served my family for decades and who could be trusted with discretion. And I settled into the cottage like a wounded animal seeking shelter, licking my wounds in solitude, trying to find some solid ground beneath my feet. The cottage itself was modest but charming, a stone building with ivy climbing its walls and a garden that had grown wild in the years since its last inhabitant had passed. There were 3 rooms on the ground floor and 2 above, with windows that looked out over rolling hills and distant forests. A stream ran behind the property, and on quiet mornings I could hear its gentle murmur through the open windows, a sound that soothed my troubled spirit. I spent my days walking the hills, tending the neglected garden, reading books I had brought from the palace library. I spent my evenings by the fire, watching the flames dance and trying not to think about the future that awaited me when my mourning period ended. I spent my nights alone in a bed that felt too large, staring at the ceiling and wondering if this emptiness would ever ease. The letter arrived 2 weeks after I took up residence. It was addressed in a masculine hand, the ink a deep blue that stood out against the cream-colored paper. The seal on the back was blank, unmarked by any family crest or identifying symbol. Inside, I found 3 pages of the most beautiful prose I had ever read. The writer called himself Edward, and he wrote to Miss Sophia Wren as if she were a woman he had glimpsed at a ball several months prior. He described her with reverent detail, her dark hair pinned with pearls, her green eyes that held depths of intelligence and sadness, her quiet smile that had haunted his dreams ever since. He apologized for his forwardness in writing to her. He confessed that he had obtained her address through discreet inquiries, hoping to establish a correspondence that might allow him to know her better. He acknowledged that she might find his approach improper, that she might burn his letter and never respond. But he begged her to consider, to give him a chance to prove himself worthy of her attention. There was something in his words that pierced me, that slipped past all my defenses and found the lonely heart beating beneath. He wrote of loneliness as if he understood it the way I did, as if it were a companion that sat beside him at every meal, slept in the chair by his fire, followed him through empty corridors at night. He wrote of duty and expectation and the suffocating weight of a life that had been chosen for him rather than by him. He wrote of longing for something true, something real, something that belonged to his heart alone. I read the letter 3 times before I set it down. My hands were trembling, though I could not have said why. This man, this Edward, was writing to another woman, a woman who had been dead for years. There was no reason for his words to affect me so deeply. And yet they did. They reached into the hollow place inside me and touched something that had not been touched in a very long time. I knew I should not reply. The woman he sought was dead, had been dead for years. The woman who had opened his letter was not the green-eyed beauty he remembered, but a grieving queen in borrowed solitude. To respond would be deception, would be the beginning of a lie that could only end in disappointment or worse. But I was so desperate for connection, so hungry for a conversation that had nothing to do with politics or treaties or the endless negotiations of war. So starved for words that spoke to my heart rather than my crown. I took up my pen and wrote back. I did not tell him my name. I signed the letter simply as S, and I told him that his words had moved me, that I too knew what it meant to feel alone in a crowded room, that I would welcome his correspondence if he wished to continue it. I did not describe myself, did not correct his impression of green eyes and pearl-pinned hair. I simply responded to his thoughts, his feelings, his longing, with thoughts and feelings and longings of my own. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself it was just words, just paper and ink, a momentary comfort that would end when my mourning period concluded and I returned to the palace. I told myself many things, all of them designed to quiet the voice in my conscience that knew I was beginning something that could not easily be undone. I gave the letter to William the next morning and asked him to post it. He did so without question, as he did all things I asked of him. And then I waited, my heart fluttering with an anticipation I had not felt in years, for a reply that I both dreaded and desired. He wrote back within the week. His second letter was longer than the first, filled with an almost boyish excitement at having received my response. He thanked me profusely for my generosity in writing back. He told me that my words had brought him more joy than he had felt in years, and then he began to share himself with me in earnest. He told me of his estate, a vast property in the eastern countryside with gardens that stretched for acres and stables that housed horses of every breed. He painted the scene with words so vivid I could see it. The great house of gray stone, the terraced lawns descending to a lake, the woodland paths where deer wandered in the early morning mist. He told me of the gardens he loved, of the roses he tended himself despite having gardeners aplenty, of the way the morning mist hung over the lawns like a veil of silver. He told me of the horses he rode across misty fields at dawn, the thunder of hooves against the earth, the only thing that made him feel truly alive. He told me of his family, of a father who had died when he was only 12, leaving him with responsibilities no child should bear. He spoke of that loss with a rawness that surprised me, a grief that had clearly never fully healed. He told me of a mother who had remarried within a year of his father's death, who had moved to the continent with her new husband and never looked back. There was no bitterness in his words, only a quiet sadness, an acceptance that still carried the weight of abandonment. He told me of the vast responsibility that had fallen upon his shoulders before he was ready to bear it, of the years he had spent learning to be what everyone expected him to be: strong, capable, commanding, cold. He spoke of the mask he wore, the persona he had constructed to protect himself from a world that demanded perfection. And he confessed that with me, in these letters, he hoped to remove that mask, to be simply Edward, simply a man reaching out for connection. He told me of the pressure to marry, of the parade of eligible women presented to him at every ball and dinner and social occasion. He described them with a mixture of pity and frustration. Daughters of nobles, selected for their bloodlines and dowries, pushed forward by ambitious parents, offering themselves like prizes to be won. He said he had danced with them, conversed with them, even courted some of them briefly. But he had never felt anything. His heart remained locked, inaccessible, untouched by their beauty or their accomplishments or their eagerness to please. Until, he wrote, he saw me across the ballroom. Until something in my eyes spoke to something in his soul. Until he found himself unable to forget a woman he had never even properly met. Of course, he was not writing about me. He was writing about Sophia Wren, the woman who had died years before, whose identity I had unknowingly assumed. But as I read his words, as I traced the elegant curves of his handwriting, I felt as if he were writing about me. I felt as if he had somehow seen through the disguise I wore, the crown and the mourning and the carefully constructed facade, and had found the lonely woman beneath. I wrote back. I wrote about my own loneliness, though I wrapped the truth in careful disguises. I spoke of a husband I had lost, though I did not say he had been a king. I spoke of a duty I could not escape, though I did not say it was the rule of a nation. I spoke of the burden of decisions that affected others, of the weight of expectations that never lifted, of the desperate desire for something that was truly my own. And so began our secret exchange. The letters became the rhythm of my days. I would wake each morning with a flutter of anticipation, wondering if today would bring a new message from Edward. When one arrived, I would carry it to my favorite spot in the garden, a stone bench beneath an ancient apple tree, and read it slowly, savoring each word like a precious delicacy. I would spend the afternoon composing my reply, drafting and redrafting until every sentence expressed exactly what I wished to convey. And then I would give the letter to William and begin the waiting again. For 5 years, we wrote to one another. The letters grew longer, deeper, more intimate with each passing season. What had begun as a desperate grasp at connection became the most important relationship of my life. In those pages, in that ink, in the words that traveled between us across miles and months, I found something I had never known before. A love that was entirely mine. He never knew who I truly was. I maintained the fiction of Sophia Wren, the quiet gentlewoman living in a country cottage, content with her solitude and her books and her garden. I told him truths wrapped in lies, sharing my thoughts and feelings while concealing my identity. And he, in turn, shared himself with me with a candor that left me breathless. He told me of the political pressures he faced, of the expectations of his position, of the constant negotiations and calculations that filled his days. He wrote of ministers and advisors, of treaties and alliances, of the endless chess game of power that he had never asked to play. He wrote of his longing for simplicity, for a life where he could tend his roses and ride his horses without the weight of responsibility crushing his shoulders. I understood him perfectly because I carried similar burdens. I wrote of my own frustrations, of meetings that stretched for hours, debating points that seemed trivial, of decisions that would affect thousands of lives made in moments of exhaustion and doubt. I wrote of the loneliness of leadership, of being surrounded by people but truly known by none, and he understood me as no one else ever had. The seasons turned year after year, and our correspondence continued. I returned to the palace after my 3 months of mourning, but I kept the cottage, visiting whenever I could find an excuse to escape the demands of court. It was there that I received his letters, there that I wrote my replies, there that I nurtured the secret garden of our love. We never exchanged portraits. I told him I was shy about my appearance, that I preferred to be known through my words rather than my face. He accepted this with grace, though he confessed that he longed to see me, that he dreamed of the green eyes he remembered from that long-ago ball. I felt a twinge of guilt at that, knowing that the woman he remembered was not me, but I could not bring myself to correct him. The fiction had become too precious to disturb. We never spoke of meeting in person. There was something sacred about the distance between us, something pure about a love that existed only in ink and paper, untouched by the complications of the physical world. In those letters, I could be myself in ways I could never be as queen. I could be vulnerable, uncertain, afraid. I could admit to doubts and dreams and desires that a sovereign was never permitted to voice. And I fell in love with him, deeply, irrevocably, dangerously in love with a man I knew only through his words. I knew it was foolish. I knew it could lead nowhere. I knew that whatever future we might have imagined was impossible, built on a foundation of deception that would crumble the moment truth was revealed. But I could not help myself. His words became my sustenance, his letters my lifeline, his love the secret treasure that made the burdens of my public life bearable. I did not know he was the Duke of Ashford. He signed his letters only as Edward, never revealing his surname or his title. He wrote of his estate and his responsibilities, but in vague terms that could have described any wealthy nobleman. I assumed he was perhaps a baron or a viscount, someone of consequence, but not of the highest rank. I never imagined that the man who wrote to me of roses and rainstorms and the ache of waking alone was the most powerful noble in the enemy kingdom, the man whose armies had clashed with my own along our shared border for 20 years. The war between our kingdoms was not a war of my making. It had begun in the reign of my husband's grandfather, rooted in disputes over territory and trade routes and ancient insults that no one alive could properly remember. Borders had shifted, battles had been fought, thousands of soldiers had died in fields that became graveyards, all for reasons that seemed increasingly obscure with each passing year. When I married King Aldrich at the age of 19, I inherited not only a crown, but a conflict. My husband had prosecuted the war dutifully, but without enthusiasm, maintaining the status quo that his predecessors had established. When he died 4 years later, I inherited the impossible task of deciding what to do next. For 3 years after his death, I worked toward peace. I sent envoys to the Ashford court, proposing negotiations. I offered concessions that my own ministers called too generous, that my own generals called weakness. I faced opposition from those who had built their careers on war, who saw peace as a threat to their power and their purpose. But I persisted, because I believed with all my heart that the war was pointless, that the blood being spilled served no purpose, that both kingdoms would prosper more in peace than they ever could in conflict. Slowly, painfully, the tide began to turn. The new emperor of Ashford, a young man named Frederick, who had inherited his throne around the same time I had inherited mine, proved to be equally weary of a war he had not started. Through intermediaries and careful diplomacy, we began to construct the framework of a lasting peace. All the while, I continued to write to Edward. I told him of my hopes for peace, though I framed them as the hopes of a subject rather than a sovereign. I told him of my belief that the war was senseless, that it benefited no one but the arms merchants and the ambitious generals who fed on conflict. He agreed with me passionately, writing that he had long believed the same, that he had argued for peace within his own circles, but had been overruled by those who profited from war. I did not know that he was one of the architects of the peace negotiations on the Ashford side. I did not know that the conciliatory messages coming from the Empire were shaped in part by his influence. I did not know that we were working toward the same goal from opposite sides, connected not just by our letters, but by our shared dream of ending the bloodshed. The final piece of the peace framework was a marriage. Not my marriage, initially. The negotiations had proposed a union between a minor princess of Aldoria and a second son of Ashford, a symbolic joining of the two houses that would cement the treaty. It was a common enough practice, the sealing of treaties through matrimony, and I had agreed to it as part of the larger agreement. But complications arose. The princess in question, a distant cousin of mine named Charlotte, refused the match. She was in love with a young captain in my own army, a man of no fortune but considerable charm, and she declared that she would sooner enter a convent than marry a stranger from an enemy nation. I could have forced her compliance. As queen, I had that power. But I remembered my own arranged marriage, the years of pleasant emptiness, the love I had never found, and I could not bring myself to condemn another woman to the same fate. The second son of Ashford proved to be similarly problematic. He was found to be secretly wed to a merchant's daughter, a marriage that would create scandal if revealed, but could not easily be dissolved. The match was impossible. The negotiations threatened to collapse. Months of careful diplomacy seemed about to crumble over the question of whose child would marry whose. And as my ministers argued and the Ashford envoys fumed, a new proposal emerged. The Duke of Ashford, the Emperor's cousin and closest advisor, would marry the Queen of Aldoria herself. I remember the moment when my chief minister, Lord Pemberton, brought me the proposal. I was in my study, reviewing correspondence, the familiar weight of governance pressing upon my shoulders. He entered with an expression that mingled hope and apprehension in equal measure, and I knew before he spoke that whatever news he carried would change everything. "The Duke of Ashford himself has offered to marry your Majesty," he said. "The union would not merge the kingdoms, but it would bind them. You would retain your crown, your sovereignty, your power. He would gain nothing but the burden of becoming consort to a foreign queen. It is an arrangement designed to prove Ashford's commitment to peace, and the Duke himself reportedly volunteered." I asked what was known of the Duke. Pemberton told me what everyone knew, that he was the most powerful nobleman in the empire, second only to the emperor himself in influence and wealth, that he was known for his intelligence and his diplomatic skill, that he was also known for his coldness, his emotional reserve, his seeming inability to connect with others on a personal level, that he had never married despite being the most eligible man in 2 kingdoms, that there were rumors, never substantiated, that his heart was already given to someone, though no one knew who. My own heart stuttered at those words. A man whose heart was given to someone unknown. A man who had never married, despite every pressure to do so. Could it be coincidence? Could the Duke of Ashford be the Edward of my letters? No, I told myself. It was impossible. The Duke was a man of politics and power, a figure of intimidating reputation. Edward was gentle, vulnerable, romantic. They could not be the same person. I was reading connections where none existed, seeing patterns in randomness because my lonely heart wanted them to be there. I agreed to meet the Duke. What else could I do? The peace depended on it, and I had spent too many years working toward that peace to let it fail over my own hesitations. But first, I had to end my correspondence with Edward. When the marriage negotiations began in earnest, I knew I could not continue a secret correspondence with another man while preparing to wed someone else. It would be a betrayal of the vows I was about to make, a deception layered upon deception. Whatever love I felt for Edward, whatever joy his letters brought me, I had to let it go for the sake of the greater good. I traveled to Hartwell Cottage one last time, seeking the solitude I needed to compose my final letter. The cottage felt different now, haunted by the ghost of the woman I had been when I first arrived, the grieving widow who had opened a stranger's letter and found salvation in his words. I sat at the small desk by the window, watching the autumn leaves drift past, and I wrote. I told him that circumstances beyond my control required me to end our exchange. I told him that I had received news that would change my life irrevocably, that I was to be married to a man I had never met, that the marriage was necessary for reasons I could not explain. I thanked him for 5 years of beauty, for the words that had sustained me through lonely nights and difficult days, for the love that had blossomed between us across miles and pages. I told him I would treasure his words forever, that I would carry them in my heart for the rest of my days. I did not tell him I loved him. I could not write those words and then write goodbye. It would have broken me. Every word cost me a piece of my heart. By the time I finished, the paper was spotted with tears I had not realized I was shedding. I sealed the letter with trembling hands and gave it to William, and then I wept for hours, mourning the loss of a love I had never been meant to have. His response arrived 2 weeks later, forwarded from the cottage to the palace. I recognized his handwriting on the envelope and felt my heart constrict with a pain so sharp it stole my breath. I waited until I was alone in my chambers to open it, knowing that whatever he had written would undo me. He begged me to reconsider. He wrote that he could not imagine a life without my letters, that I had become necessary to his existence, that the thought of never hearing from me again was unbearable. He wrote of coming to find me, of abandoning everything to be with me, of casting aside duty and expectation and responsibility if only I would let him. My heart broke and mended and broke again as I read his words. Part of me wanted nothing more than to write back, to tell him yes, to flee to whatever future we might build together. But I was a queen. I had a duty to my people, a peace to secure, a war to end. I could not abandon everything for a love that existed only on paper, no matter how much my heart yearned to do exactly that. I did not respond. I could not. I locked his letters in a box and buried them in my memory, and I turned my face toward the future I had chosen. The Duke of Ashford arrived at my palace on a gray afternoon in late autumn. The sky was heavy with clouds that threatened rain, and the wind carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. I received him in the throne room, surrounded by my ministers and advisers, dressed in the formal black of my perpetual mourning. I had prepared myself to meet a cold man, a calculating man, the ruthless enemy I had been taught to fear since childhood. What I was not prepared for was the way my heart stopped when he walked through the door. He was tall and dark-haired, with a face that might have been carved from stone, all sharp angles and severe lines. His eyes were the color of a winter sea, gray and deep and touched with something that looked almost like pain. He moved with the controlled grace of a man who had been trained from birth to command, every step measured, every gesture deliberate. He wore the formal attire of an Ashford nobleman, dark blue velvet trimmed with silver, and a sword hung at his side in a scabbard that bore his family's crest. When he stopped before my throne and bowed, there was nothing subservient in the gesture. He was acknowledging my rank, not submitting to it. His eyes met mine as he rose, and I felt a jolt of recognition that made no sense, a sense of knowing that had no rational explanation. "Your Majesty," he said, and his voice was deep and resonant, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard. "It is my honor to present myself as a candidate for your hand, and to offer my service in the cause of peace between our nations." I descended from my throne to greet him, my legs unsteady beneath the heavy skirts of my gown. When I extended my hand, he took it with a gentleness that surprised me, his fingers warm against my cold skin. He raised my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my knuckles, a formal greeting, nothing more, and yet the touch sent a shiver through me that I could not explain. We dined together that evening, a formal affair with 40 guests and 7 courses, and conversation so stilted and diplomatic that I wanted to scream. He sat beside me at the head of the table, close enough that I could smell the clean scent of him, something like cedar and sandalwood and fresh air. Every time his arm brushed against mine, I felt a jolt of something electric pass through me. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself it was the strangeness of sitting beside a man I had been raised to consider an enemy. I told myself it was anything but what it truly was, a recognition that my heart understood long before my mind caught up. That night, alone in my chambers, I found myself thinking of Edward. I wondered where he was, what he was doing, whether he had found someone else to love. I wondered if he ever thought of me, if he still kept my letters, if he remembered the words we had shared. And I wept quietly and bitterly for the love I had surrendered for the sake of peace. The negotiations continued for a month. The Duke and I met daily, sometimes with our ministers, sometimes alone. We discussed borders and trade routes, tariffs and military withdrawals, prisoner exchanges and reparations. He was intelligent and thorough, quick to identify problems and creative in proposing solutions. He argued passionately for terms that would benefit both kingdoms, refusing to press for advantages that would humiliate Aldoria or undermine the peace we were trying to build. He was also, I discovered, unexpectedly kind. When one of my younger ministers made an error in his calculations during a meeting, the Duke corrected him privately rather than embarrassing him before the assembly. When a servant girl spilled wine on his sleeve at dinner, he assured her it was nothing and sent her away with a smile that transformed his stern face into something almost beautiful. I began to see past the mask of coldness he wore. Beneath it was a man who carried heavy burdens, who had never been permitted to show weakness, who had armored himself against a world that demanded perfection. He reminded me in some ways of Edward. There was the same loneliness in his eyes, the same hunger for something real beneath the surface of duty and obligation. I began to look forward to our meetings. I began to notice the way his hair fell across his forehead when he leaned over documents, the way his hands moved when he made a point, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he suppressed a smile. I began to feel things I had not expected to feel, things that complicated my already confused heart. One evening, after a particularly difficult session with the ministers, he asked if I would walk with him in the gardens. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and the air was cool and sweet with the scent of late-blooming flowers. We walked in silence for a time, side by side along the gravel paths, and I found the silence comfortable rather than awkward. He told me he had always loved gardens. He told me about the roses he tended himself at his estate, the different varieties he cultivated, the satisfaction of watching something beautiful grow under his care. He told me that working in the garden was the only time he felt truly at peace, the only time he could forget the weight of his responsibilities. I understood, I told him. I had felt the same way about Hartwell Cottage, about the small garden I had tended there during my months of mourning. I had not meant to reveal that much, but the words slipped out before I could stop them. He looked at me with an expression I could not read. "Hartwell Cottage," he repeated, "in the Aldorian countryside?" I felt my heart skip. "Yes," I said, suddenly wary. "Do you know it?" "I have heard the name," he said. Nothing more. But there was something in his voice, something careful and controlled, that made me wonder what he was not saying. The days passed, and our connection deepened. We debated philosophy and discussed literature. We shared stories of our childhoods, our hopes, our disappointments. We laughed together, something that surprised us both, two people who had rarely found occasion to laugh in their lives of duty and solemnity. I found myself increasingly confused. My heart was supposed to belong to Edward, the man I had loved through letters, the man I had sacrificed for the sake of peace. But my heart was also being drawn to this Duke, this stern and complex man who was revealing himself to me layer by layer. Was I faithless? Was I fickle? Or was I simply human, capable of feeling new things even while mourning the old? On the last night before our wedding, I went to his chambers to discuss a final detail of the treaty, a clause about river navigation rights that my ministers had raised concerns about at the last moment. It was a minor issue, easily resolved, but I seized upon it as an excuse because I found that I did not want to spend the evening before my wedding alone with my thoughts. His valet admitted me and then withdrew, leaving us alone in a room lit by firelight and candles. The Duke stood by the window, looking out at the darkness, and when he turned to face me, there was something raw in his expression, something unguarded that I had never seen before. We settled the matter of the river rights quickly, but neither of us moved to end the conversation. We spoke of the ceremony planned for the following day, of the guests who had arrived from both kingdoms, of the significance of what we were about to do. And then, somehow, we spoke of other things, of loneliness, of duty, of the weight of crowns and the price of peace. He told me he had never wanted to marry, that he had believed himself incapable of love, that he had resigned himself to a life of solitary duty. He told me he had always felt different from other men, unable to connect, unable to feel what they seemed to feel so easily. And then he stopped. His face changed, the careful mask slipping to reveal something painful beneath. "There was someone," he said. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "A woman I never met. I knew her only through letters. My blood turned to ice in my veins. I could not speak, could not move, could only stand there as he continued. For 5 years we wrote to one another," he said. "She was my only joy, my only respite from the darkness of my world. I loved her more than I have ever loved anything or anyone. And then, months ago, she ended our correspondence. She told me she was to be married, that she could not continue. I have been searching for her ever since." I asked him, barely able to form the words, what name she had used. "She signed her letters only as S," he said. "I addressed my own letters to a Miss Sophia Wren at Hartwell Cottage. I sent men to find the cottage, but it had been empty for years. The woman who had lived there died long before my letters began." The room spun around me. I reached out and grasped the back of a chair to steady myself. He was Edward. He had been Edward all along. The love I had mourned, the love I had sacrificed, had been standing before me for a month, without either of us knowing. I should have told him then. I should have confessed everything, should have fallen into his arms and revealed the truth that burned in my throat like fire. But I was afraid, terrified of what he would think, how he would react, whether he would hate me for the deception, even though I had never meant to deceive him. I was terrified that the love in his letters had been for an illusion, for a woman who did not exist, and that when he learned the truth, he would see me only as the enemy queen who had stolen something precious from him. So I said nothing. I expressed sympathy for his loss. I wished him peace, and I fled to my own chambers like the coward I was. That night, I could not sleep. I paced my room until dawn, torn between confession and silence. I took out his letters and read them again, every word searing itself into my memory. I thought of all the things he had written, all the dreams he had shared, all the love he had poured onto those pages. And I realized that I could not marry him without telling him the truth. But when I went to his chambers in the morning, I found them empty. His valet told me the Duke had risen early and gone riding, that he often did so when he needed to think. I waited for his return, but the hours passed, and he did not come. The wedding was set for noon. The guests were arriving, carriages clogging the palace drive, nobles in their finest attire streaming through the great doors. The cathedral was being prepared, flowers arranged, candles lit, the altar draped in cloth of gold. My ladies-in-waiting arrived to dress me, to arrange my hair, to drape me in the ivory silk and pearls that would mark me as a bride. I was standing before the mirror, my wedding gown a confection of lace and satin that my ladies had spent hours arranging, when the door burst open and he strode in. His hair was windswept, his riding clothes mud-stained, and in his hand he held a letter. My letter. The final letter I had written to him, the one in which I had said goodbye. I felt the blood drain from my face. My ladies gasped at the impropriety of his entrance, but I dismissed them with a wave of my hand, my eyes never leaving his face. He had found it, he said. He had gone back to Hartwell Cottage one last time, desperate for any trace of the woman he loved. The cottage had been empty, abandoned, covered in dust and cobwebs. But he had searched it anyway, room by room, corner by corner, and he had found this letter hidden in a crack beneath the floorboards of the bedroom, where it must have fallen when I packed my belongings to leave. He had read my words, my final words, and he had recognized something, a turn of phrase, a particular way of expressing an idea. Something I had said to him during our negotiations, something that echoed what I had written in that letter. He knew. He looked at me with those winter sea eyes, and I saw the storm raging within them. He knew that I was S. He knew that I was the woman he had loved for 5 years, and he did not know whether to embrace me or despise me. I told him everything. The words poured out of me like water from a broken dam, unstoppable, uncontrollable. I told him about finding his first letter, about my loneliness, about the desperate hunger for connection that had driven me to respond. I told him I had never meant to deceive him, that I had not known who he was, that when I had ended our correspondence, it was because I could not continue to love one man while preparing to marry another. I told him that I had loved him, that I still loved him, that the month we had spent together had only deepened what I felt. He stood in silence for a long moment, his face unreadable. The letter trembled in his hand. The clock on the mantel ticked away the minutes until our wedding was to begin. And then he asked me why I had not told him the truth when he confessed his love for S the night before. Why I had let him pour out his heart without revealing that the woman he mourned was standing before him. I told him I was afraid. I told him I was terrified that he would hate me, that he would see me only as an enemy who had stolen something precious, that the love he felt for S would not survive the revelation that she was the Queen of Aldoria. I told him I was a coward and I was sorry, and I would understand if he wanted to end the engagement and return to his kingdom in disgust. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took my face in his hands. His palms were warm against my cheeks, his thumbs brushing away tears I had not realized I was shedding. His eyes blazed with something fierce and bright, something that made my heart pound against my ribs. He said that he could never hate me, that he had fallen in love with my words long before he knew my face, and that when he met me, when he spent those weeks at my side, he had felt something stirring in his heart that he could not explain. He had been drawn to me, confused by it, troubled by feelings for a woman he was marrying for political convenience, while his heart still belonged to another. And now he understood. Now he knew that the woman in the letters and the woman in the flesh were one and the same, and that his heart had recognized me even when his mind could not. He kissed me then. His lips met mine with a tenderness that made my knees weak, a gentleness that belied the intensity in his eyes. I melted into him, 5 years of longing finally given form, and when we parted, both of us breathless, he smiled for the first time since I had known him, a real smile that transformed his stern face into something beautiful. We were married that afternoon, in a cathedral filled with nobles from 2 kingdoms who had spent 20 years as enemies. The ceremony was grand and solemn, the words ancient and binding, but I barely heard them. All I could see was him, standing beside me, his hand holding mine, his eyes never leaving my face. When the priest pronounced us husband and wife, when the Duke placed a ring upon my finger and I placed one upon his, I felt the weight of history shifting around us. This was not just a marriage. It was the end of a war. It was the beginning of something new. But the challenges of our union were only beginning. News of our marriage spread quickly, carried by messengers and newspapers and the endless gossip of the courts. And not everyone was pleased. There were factions in both kingdoms who had profited from the war, who had built their power upon the conflict, who saw peace as a threat to their influence. In Ashford there were nobles who whispered that the Duke had betrayed his nation by marrying the enemy queen. They called him a traitor, a fool, a man who had surrendered to the enemy without even the excuse of military defeat. They gathered in shadowy corners and plotted ways to undermine the peace he had helped to build. In Aldoria, there were ministers who feared that I had surrendered my independence, that my husband would seek to control me, that our kingdom would become a puppet of the empire. They questioned every decision I made, looking for signs of foreign influence, waiting for the moment when the Duke's true intentions would be revealed. We faced these whispers together. In public, we presented a united front, attending ceremonies and councils side by side, demonstrating through every gesture that our partnership was one of equals. When decisions were to be made, we made them together, consulting with advisors from both kingdoms, seeking solutions that would benefit all rather than favor one side over the other. In private, we learned each other's hearts as we had once learned each other's words. We stayed up late into the night, talking and laughing and sharing the thousands of small details that letters could not convey. He told me about his childhood, about the father who had died too young, about the mother who had abandoned him for a new life on the continent. He told me about the years of loneliness, the mask of coldness he had constructed to protect himself, the certainty that he would never find anyone who truly understood him. I told him about my own youth, about the princess who had dreamed of books and gardens and instead found herself married to a king. I told him about the lonely years of my first marriage, about the husband who was kind but distant, who respected me but never truly loved me. I told him about Hartwell Cottage, about the grief and the solitude and the letter that had changed everything. We discovered that we complemented each other in ways we had not expected. Where I was patient, he was decisive. Where he was stern, I was gentle. In matters of state, we found a rhythm, a balance that made us stronger together than either of us had been alone. He advised me on military affairs, on the complex politics of the empire, on the machinations of nobles who sought to undermine our alliance. I advised him on diplomacy, on the art of persuasion, on the delicate negotiations required to transform enemies into friends. And slowly, carefully, we built a peace that lasted. The first year of our marriage was the hardest. There were assassination attempts, plots uncovered just in time by loyal servants and vigilant guards. There were tense confrontations with those who could not accept the new order, angry nobles who challenged our decisions, ministers who resigned in protest. There were nights when we lay awake in the darkness, holding each other, wondering if we had made a terrible mistake. But we survived them all. We emerged from each crisis stronger, our bond deepened by shared danger and mutual trust. We learned to rely on each other in ways that went beyond politics, beyond duty, beyond the roles we played for the world. We became partners in the truest sense, two halves of a whole that neither had known they were missing. 3 years into our marriage, we faced our greatest test. A faction of nobles in Ashford, men who had lost power and influence when the war ended, attempted to assassinate my husband. They poisoned his wine at a banquet, a slow-acting venom that was meant to make his death appear natural. But something went wrong with their plan. The dose was too small, or my husband's constitution too strong, and instead of dying quietly in his sleep, he fell gravely ill. For 3 weeks I sat by his bedside, watching him fight for his life. The physicians came and went, their faces grim, their prognoses growing darker with each passing day. The ministers pressed me to prepare for succession, to consider what would happen if the Duke did not recover. The spies and investigators worked to uncover the plotters, to bring them to justice before they could strike again. But I could think of nothing but him. Nothing but the man who lay pale and fevered on the bed where we had shared so much happiness. Nothing but the fear that I would lose him, that the love we had built would be stolen from me by men who cared nothing for peace or partnership or the sanctity of human connection. I read his letters to him during those long nights, all of them, from the very first to the most recent. I read them aloud in a voice that trembled with fear and hope, believing somehow that my words, his words, our words, could reach him wherever he had gone in his fevered dreams and guide him back to me. And he did come back. Slowly, painfully, fighting every step of the way, he returned from the edge of death. The first words he spoke when he opened his eyes and saw me sitting beside him were words I will never forget. "You kept reading," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I heard you. I heard our letters. They brought me home." I wept then, holding his hand, pressing my forehead to his fingers, letting the tears fall without shame or restraint. He was alive. He was going to live. And our story was not yet finished. The plotters were caught and brought to justice. Some were executed for treason. Others were exiled to distant lands where they could cause no further harm. The peace held, strengthened by the outpouring of support from both kingdoms when news of the assassination attempt became public. People who had once been enemies now stood united in their condemnation of those who would destroy what we had built. But the experience changed me. It taught me how fragile happiness can be, how quickly the things we love can be torn away. It taught me to treasure every moment, every letter, every whispered word in the darkness. It taught me that love is not something to be taken for granted, but something to be nurtured and protected and celebrated every single day. By the 5th year of our marriage, the peace had taken firm root. Trade flourished between our kingdoms, merchants traveling freely where armies had once marched. Borders that had been battlefields became bustling crossings. Towns that had cowered in fear of attack now prospered with commerce. The soldiers who had spent their lives fighting learned new skills, became farmers and craftsmen and builders. The children born in those years would grow up knowing peace as their birthright, war as nothing but a story from their grandparents' time. Our love, too, had taken firm root. What had begun in letters, nurtured through revelation and trial, had grown into something strong and enduring. We were no longer two lonely souls reaching for connection. We were partners, companions, lovers in the truest sense of the word. We had built a life together that neither of us could have imagined. A life that was richer and fuller than either of us had dared to hope. There were moments of pure joy that I treasure above all else. The afternoon we escaped the palace in disguise and wandered through the city markets like common folk, eating pastries from street vendors and watching puppeteers perform for crowds of delighted onlookers. We stole kisses in shadowed doorways, laughed at each other's attempts to haggle, returned to the palace windswept and happy, with crumbs on our clothes and joy in our hearts. There was the night we stayed up until dawn, debating philosophy and politics, our voices growing hoarse, our minds sharp with the pleasure of intellectual combat. He challenged my assumptions, and I challenged his, and when we finally fell silent, exhausted but exhilarated, we realized that the sun was rising and neither of us had noticed the passage of time. There was the morning I woke to find he had filled our chambers with flowers, hundreds of blooms in every color, roses and lilies and peonies and flowers I could not name. He had remembered something I had written in a letter years before, a passing comment that flowers made me happy, and he had honored that memory with a gesture so extravagant, so romantic, that I could not speak for several minutes. He remembered everything I had ever written to him, every preference, every dream, every casual observation. He remembered and he honored those memories with small gestures that accumulated over time into a monument of devotion. I tried to do the same for him. I learned his favorite foods and had the kitchen prepare them on difficult days. I memorized the poems he loved and recited them to him when he could not sleep. I created a garden in the palace grounds modeled after the one he had described in his letters, the garden where he had played as a child, with the same arrangement of paths and flowers and the same stone bench beneath the ancient oak. I watched his face when he first saw it, watched the tears he tried to hide, watched the gratitude and love that no words could express. We built our life letter by letter, gesture by gesture, day by day, and the love that had begun in ink and paper became something far more profound. It became a foundation, a shelter, a home that we carried within us wherever we went. The people of our kingdoms, who had once viewed our marriage with suspicion, gradually came to embrace it. They saw the peace that flourished under our joint rule, the prosperity that followed the end of war, the stability that replaced decades of uncertainty. They saw us together at public events, the way we looked at each other, the way our hands found each other even in the midst of ceremony and protocol. And slowly, their suspicion turned to acceptance, and acceptance turned to something approaching affection. We became beloved, not just as rulers, but as symbols of what was possible when enemies chose love over hate. Our story was told and retold until it took on the quality of legend, until the truth of it became almost secondary to its meaning. But I know the truth. I lived it. And the truth is both simpler and more complex than any legend can capture. The truth is that love is work. It is choice, made again and again, in moments large and small. It is the decision to be honest when lies would be easier, to be vulnerable when armor would be safer, to be present when distance would be more comfortable. It is two imperfect people choosing to be imperfect together, supporting each other's weaknesses, celebrating each other's strengths, building something greater than either could build alone. Now, as I write these words, 15 years have passed since that first letter arrived at Hartwell Cottage. I am no longer a young widow hiding from her crown. I am a queen in truth, respected by my people, feared by those who would threaten them, loved by a man who knows me better than anyone else in the world. He is beside me now, my husband, reading by the fire while I write at my desk. He has gray at his temples that was not there before, and lines around his eyes that deepen when he smiles. He still writes me letters. He still slips them under my pillow. Last night, I found one that said simply, "I loved you before I knew your face, and I will love you long after I have forgotten my own name." I keep every letter he has ever written. The original ones, from those 5 years of secret correspondence, are stored in a velvet box in my private chambers, alongside the hundreds of new ones he has written since our marriage. Sometimes I take them out and read them, tracing the evolution of our love from uncertainty to passion to the deep, steady warmth that sustains us through all things. The peace we built has held. There have been challenges, moments when old tensions threaten to reignite, but we have faced them together, and together we have prevailed. Our kingdoms are not one, but they are united in purpose, in prosperity, in the shared dream of a future without war. I think sometimes of the woman I was when I first opened his letter. That lonely queen in her borrowed cottage, so desperate for connection that she answered a stranger's words with her own. I think of the fear that kept me silent, the courage that finally made me speak, the love that transformed everything. I think of what might have happened if I had returned that first letter, if I had been honest from the beginning, if I had never gone to Hartwell Cottage at all. 1,000 different paths our lives might have taken, 1,000 different endings to our story. But I do not regret the path we walked. Every deception, every revelation, every moment of doubt and fear and joy led us here, to this life we share, to this love we have built. The letters were not a lie. They were the truest thing I have ever written. In them, I was myself in ways I could be nowhere else. And in his letters, he was himself. Two souls reaching for each other through the darkness, finding each other against all odds. He is calling me now, my husband. There is a council meeting to attend, decisions to be made, the endless work of ruling that fills our days. But tonight, when the candles are lit and the palace grows quiet, we will sit together by the fire. He will read to me, perhaps, or I will read to him. We will talk of small things and great things and everything in between. And before we sleep, he will hold me close and whisper words that no letter could ever contain. I am Vivian, Queen of Aldoria, wife of the Duke of Ashford. I am the woman who wrote letters to a stranger and found the love of my life. I am the enemy queen who watched him recite the very words she had written, who saw his face transform from confusion to wonder to joy, and I am happy. After everything, after all the years of loneliness and loss, after the war and the secrets and the fear, I am finally, truly, deeply happy. The letters led me home. Some say that fate is written in the stars, that our lives are predetermined, that we are merely players acting out a script composed before our births. I do not believe this. I believe that we make our own fate, one choice at a time, one word at a time, one letter at a time. I believe that the path to love is not straight or certain, that it winds through darkness and doubt, that it requires courage and honesty and the willingness to risk everything for the chance of something true. I risked everything when I answered that first letter. I risked my heart, my reputation, my very identity. And I would do it again, 1,000 times over, because the risk led me to him. He tells me sometimes that he cannot imagine his life without me, that the years before we met were gray and empty, that I brought color into his world, that I taught him what it meant to truly live. He says these things with such sincerity, such tenderness, that I am moved to tears every time. But he taught me as well. He taught me that strength does not require solitude, that vulnerability is not weakness, that love is not a distraction from duty, but the very heart of it. He taught me that I could be both queen and woman, both ruler and wife, both the face that kingdoms know and the soul that only one man will ever truly see. We have built something beautiful together, he and I. Not just a peace between nations, though that would be legacy enough. We have built a partnership, a friendship, a love that deepens with every passing year. We have built a life that neither of us could have imagined, a life that began with a misdirected letter and a lonely woman's desperate response. I have kept something from this account, something I have shared with no one except him. In my final letter to Edward, the one I thought would end our correspondence forever, I wrote a line that I believed he would never read. I wrote that if I could not have him in truth, I would have him in memory, and that memory would sustain me through whatever loveless future awaited. He found that letter. He read those words. And on our wedding night, after the guests had gone and the palace had grown still, he took my hand and led me to the window where moonlight spilled across the floor like silver water. He told me that I would never need memory to sustain me, that he was here, that he was real, that every dream we had shared in our letters, we would now live together. And then he recited my own words back to me, the words I had written in that final letter, and I wept because they had been a farewell, but had become instead a promise. I loved you before I knew your name, he said. I loved you before I knew your face. I loved you when you were nothing but words on a page, and I love you now that you are flesh and blood and breath before me. I will love you until the last letter is written, until the last word is spoken, until the last star falls from the sky. And even then, even in the darkness beyond darkness, I will love you still. These were my words, transformed by his voice into something new. These were the words of a woman who had given up hope, now spoken by a man who had restored it. And in that moment, I understood that our story was not one of deception or coincidence, but of recognition. We had recognized each other, soul to soul, across the distance of paper and ink. We had recognized each other, even when we stood face to face without knowing. And we recognized each other now, in the moonlight, in the silence, in the sacred space between one heartbeat and the next. This is the story of how I found love in the most unexpected of places. This is the story of letters and secrets, of enemies and allies, of a queen who hid behind a borrowed name and a duke who poured his heart onto pages he thought would never be answered. This is the story of two people who were meant to find each other, who nearly lost each other, who finally came together in a union that changed the fate of nations. It is not a fairy tale. It is better. It is real. And it began with a letter that was never meant for me at all. The candles are burning low now, and the palace is quiet. He is sleeping beside me, my husband, his breath slow and even, his hand still resting where it fell across my waist. I have written these words by the light of a single flame, pouring my heart onto paper one last time, honoring the tradition that brought us together. Tomorrow, I will place this account in the velvet box with all his other letters. Tomorrow, it will become part of our archive, part of the record of a love that changed the course of history. But tonight, it is simply the truth, spoken at last, complete at last, offered to the silence with gratitude and wonder. I loved him before I knew his name. I loved him before I knew his face. I loved him when he was nothing but words on a page, and I love him now that he has been my companion for more years than I can count. I will love him until the last letter is written, until the last word is spoken, until the last star falls from the sky. And even then, even in the darkness beyond darkness, I will love him still. This I swear, by all the letters ever written, by all the words ever spoken, by all the love that two hearts can hold. This I swear, and this I know to be true. Forever and always, in ink and in flesh, in words and in silence, in life and whatever comes after, I am his and he is mine. There is one more thing I must tell you before I lay down my pen. One more memory that rises now as I near the end of this account. A memory that captures the essence of what we built together. It was a winter evening, 5 years after our wedding, and snow was falling softly outside the palace windows. We had spent the day in separate meetings, he with the military advisors reviewing border patrols, I with the treasury officials discussing the budget for the coming year. The work of governance never ceased, a river that flowed endlessly through our lives, demanding attention even in moments when our hearts yearned for quiet. When I finally returned to our chambers, I found him standing by the window, watching the snow fall. The firelight cast warm shadows across his face, softening the sharp lines I had come to love so dearly. He did not turn when I entered, but I saw his shoulders relax, as they always did when he sensed my presence. I crossed the room and stood beside him, looking out at the white world forming beyond the glass. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We had learned over the years that silence between us could be as eloquent as any words, that simply being together was enough. "Do you remember," he said finally, his voice soft and contemplative, "the first letter I ever wrote to you?" I smiled, though he could not see it. "I remember every word," I told him. "You wrote about loneliness, about feeling different from everyone around you, about longing for something true." He nodded slowly. "I was so afraid when I wrote that letter, afraid that I was being foolish, reaching out to a woman I had glimpsed only once, afraid that she would think me mad, or pathetic, or both. I almost burned it a dozen times before I finally gathered the courage to send it." I reached for his hand and laced my fingers through his. "And yet you sent it." He turned to look at me then, and in his eyes I saw the same wonder that I had seen on our wedding day, the same wonder that never seemed to diminish no matter how many years passed. "And you answered." Of all the women in all the world, a queen of an enemy nation answered my letter. A queen who had every reason to ignore me, to dismiss me, to throw my words into the fire. But you answered. I was lonely too, I said. I was desperate. I was drowning in grief and duty and the weight of a crown I never asked to wear. Your letter was like a rope thrown to a drowning woman. I grasped it without thinking, because the alternative was to sink. He lifted our joined hands and pressed a kiss to my knuckles, the same gesture he had made when we first met, when he was a stranger bowing before my throne. But it meant so much more now, weighted with years of shared history, with struggles overcome, with a love that had been tested and proven true. Sometimes I try to imagine what my life would have been without those letters, he said. Without you, I would have married eventually, I suppose. Some noble woman chosen for her bloodline and connections. I would have done my duty, produced heirs, lived out my days in the cold efficiency that everyone expected of me. And I would have died without ever knowing what it meant to truly love. I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart through the fabric of his coat. And I would have married too, I said. Some foreign prince, perhaps, or a nobleman from my own court, someone suitable, someone appropriate, someone who would never have known the woman beneath the crown, because I would never have shown her to anyone. We stood there for a long time, watching the snow erase the world outside, covering everything in a blanket of white. It felt symbolic somehow, as if the heavens were offering us a reminder that even the most barren landscape could be transformed. That beauty could emerge from cold and darkness if one only had the patience to wait. The letters saved us both, he said finally. They created a space where we could be ourselves, where titles and politics and the weight of nations fell away. In those letters, I was just Edward, and you were just S, two souls reaching across the darkness. Yes, I agreed. And when we finally found each other, when we discovered that the love in those letters was real, that the connection we had built was not a fantasy, but a foundation, everything changed. We changed. He wrapped his arm around me and pulled me closer, and I felt the warmth of him seep into my bones, driving away the chill of the winter night. We did change, he said. We became who we were always meant to be, not alone, but together. Not struggling separately against the current, but building something new, something better, something that neither of us could have built alone. I thought of all the letters we had exchanged over the years, the hundreds of pages covered in his elegant script and my careful hand. Letters of longing and confession, letters of joy and grief, letters that charted the course of two lives becoming one. I thought of the velvet box where I kept them all, a treasury more precious to me than any crown jewel. Do you know what I love most about our story? I asked him. He looked down at me, his eyes soft in the firelight. Tell me that it is not finished, that every day we write new pages, add new chapters, that the love that began in those letters continues to grow, to deepen, to become more than either of us imagined it could be. We are still writing our story, you and I cannot wait to see what comes next. He smiled then, that rare and beautiful smile that still made my heart skip after all these years. Neither can I, he said, neither can I. The snow continued to fall, and we stood together at the window, watching the world transform. Behind us, the fire crackled and whispered. Beyond the palace walls, our kingdoms slept in peace, their borders open, their people prospering. And in that quiet moment, in that simple embrace, I felt the full weight of all we had accomplished, all we had become. We had started as enemies, representatives of nations locked in generations of conflict. We had become correspondents, anonymous souls pouring our hearts onto paper. We had become allies, then partners, then lovers, then husband and wife. And through it all, through every trial and triumph, the letters had remained our constant, our touchstone, the thread that bound our lives together. I pulled back slightly, and looked up at him, this man who had traveled such an impossible journey to stand beside me. "I love you," I said, the words as natural as breathing, as essential as heartbeat. "I loved you when you were just words on a page, and I love you now more than I ever dreamed possible. Thank you for writing that first letter. Thank you for being brave enough to reach out. Thank you for finding me." His eyes glistened in the firelight, and I saw him blink rapidly, fighting back the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "Thank you for answering," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "Thank you for giving a lonely man something to hope for. Thank you for being the woman in the letters and the queen before me and everything in between. Thank you for loving me." We kissed then, softly and sweetly, a kiss that contained all the passion of our first embrace and all the tenderness of our 15 years together. When we finally parted, he rested his forehead against mine, and we breathed together, two hearts beating as one. The night deepened around us, the snow falling ever more thickly, but neither of us moved to light more candles or to stoke the dying fire. We simply held each other, content in the warmth we had created, at peace in the love we had built. Later, when we finally retired to our bed, he reached beneath his pillow and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "Another letter?" I asked, smiling. He nodded, handing it to me with an almost shy expression, the same expression he must have worn when he sent that first letter to Hartwell Cottage all those years ago. "I wrote it this afternoon," he said, "while you were in your meeting with the Treasury officials. I wanted to give it to you tonight." I unfolded the paper and read by the light of the single candle still burning on the nightstand. The words blurred before my eyes, not because they were illegible, but because tears made it impossible to see clearly. He had written about finding my final letter at Hartwell Cottage, about the moment he realized that the woman he loved and the queen he was to marry were one and the same. He had written about the fear and the hope that had warred within him as he rode back to the palace, about the way his heart had pounded when he burst into my chamber and saw me standing there in my wedding gown. He had written about the 15 years since, about every joy and sorrow, every triumph and trial, and he had ended with a promise. "I will keep writing to you," he had written, "for as long as I have breath in my body and ink in my pen. I will keep telling you how much I love you, how grateful I am for every moment we share, how blessed I feel to have found you against all odds. These letters are my legacy to you, my testament of devotion, my proof that love can be written into existence and sustained through words. Read them when I am gone, and know that wherever I am, whatever comes after this life, I will still be loving you." I could not speak when I finished reading. I simply reached for him, pulling him close, burying my face against his chest. He held me as I wept, his own tears falling silently into my hair. We slept that night wrapped in each other's arms, the letter pressed between us like a sacred relic. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. And inside, in the warmth of our love, two people who had once been strangers slept the peaceful sleep of those who have found their way home. That is the memory I wanted to share with you before I close this account. That winter night, that letter, that embrace. It captures something essential about our love, something that transcends the drama of revelation and the politics of peace. It captures the quiet truth at the heart of everything. Two people, deeply and completely in love, building a life together one letter at a time. The years have continued to pass since that snowy evening. We are older now, our hair more silver than dark, our steps slower than they once were. But the love has not diminished. If anything, it has grown stronger, deeper, more essential to our very being. We are woven together now, he and I, threads in a single tapestry that cannot be separated without destroying the whole. He still writes me letters. Every week, without fail, I find a new one beneath my pillow or tucked into the pocket of my cloak or hidden among the papers on my desk. Some are long and philosophical, exploring the nature of love and duty and the meaning we make of our brief lives. Some are short and simple, just a few lines declaring his love and his gratitude. Some are playful, filled with jokes and teasing observations that make me laugh until my sides ache. But all of them are treasures, additions to the velvet box that now overflows with proof of his devotion. I write to him as well, of course. It would not be fair to receive such gifts without offering any in return. My letters tend toward the poetic, filled with imagery and metaphor, attempts to capture in words the emotions that sometimes feel too large for language. He tells me my letters are beautiful, that he reads them over and over again, that he has memorized passages that he recites to himself in moments when we are apart. I believe him, because I do the same with his. The story I have told you is drawing to a close, but our story continues. Every day brings new chapters, new adventures, new opportunities to deepen the love we share. We have faced challenges and emerged stronger. We have tasted joy and learned to savor it. We have weathered storms and found shelter in each other's arms. And through it all, the letters have remained. The letters that brought us together. The letters that sustained us through darkness. The letters that continue to bind us in a chain of words and love that nothing can break. I am an old woman now, but when I read his letters, I feel young again. I feel like the grieving queen who opened a stranger's message and found a kindred soul. I feel like the woman who fell in love with words on a page, who built an entire relationship out of ink and paper and longing. I feel like the bride who stood in her wedding gown and discovered that her secret love was standing before her, that fate or chance or the mysterious workings of the universe had brought them together against all odds. Love, I have learned, is not a single moment but a continuous act of creation. It is not a destination but a journey without end. It is not something you find and keep, but something you build and rebuild every single day. The letters taught me that. He taught me that. And I have tried to live that truth in every moment of our life together. The candle is guttering now, its flame dancing in the last pool of wax. My hand is tired from writing, my eyes heavy with the need for sleep. But I wanted to finish this account, to tell the story as completely as I could, to leave a record of the love that defined my life and changed the fate of two nations. If you have read this far, you know everything now. You know how we met, how we loved, how we found each other through a miracle of misdirected mail and desperate loneliness. You know the challenges we faced and the triumphs we celebrated. You know the depth of our devotion and the strength of our bond. But there is one last thing I want to tell you. One final truth that rises to the surface as I prepare to set down my pen. Love is worth the risk. Whatever fears hold you back, whatever doubts whisper in your ear, whatever practical concerns urge you toward caution, love is worth the risk. I risked everything when I answered that first letter, and I would do it again 1,000 times over. Because the reward was greater than anything I could have imagined. Because the love I found was richer and deeper and more transforming than any love I had dreamed possible. Because he was waiting for me, waiting for someone to reach back across the darkness. And if I had not been brave enough to answer, we both would have remained alone. So risk, reach out, write the letter, make the confession, take the chance. You may fail. You may face rejection or disappointment or heartbreak. But you may also find what I found, a love that transcends barriers, a connection that defies logic, a partner who makes everything worthwhile. The letters led me home. May your own letters, whatever form they take, lead you home as well. I am Vivian, Queen of Aldoria, wife of the Duke of Ashford. I am the woman who found love in the most unexpected of places, who built a life out of words and hope and courage. I am old now, but I am happy. I am loved. I am complete. And it all began with a letter that was never meant for me at all. There is a postscript I must add, a final chapter that I had not intended to write, but that demands inclusion now that I have come this far. Yesterday, I visited Hartwell Cottage for the first time in many years. My husband accompanied me, as he always does when I undertake journeys of the heart. The carriage ride was long and quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts, remembering the people we had been when this place had loomed so large in our lives. The cottage itself had changed little. The stone walls still stood sturdy against the elements, though the ivy had grown thicker, nearly obscuring the windows on the eastern side. The garden had been tended in our absence by a caretaker I had employed, and it bloomed with the same wild beauty I remembered, roses and honeysuckle and lavender filling the air with perfume. We walked the grounds hand in hand, retracing the paths I had walked alone during those months of mourning. I showed him the apple tree where I had sat to read his letters, the stone bench worn smooth by years of weather and use. I showed him the bedroom where I had written my responses, the desk by the window where I had poured out my heart. I showed him the loose floorboard where my final letter had fallen, the letter that had ultimately led him back to me. He was quiet throughout the tour, his face unreadable, but I could feel the emotion radiating from him like heat from a banked fire. When we finally returned to the main room, he drew me into his arms and held me with a fierceness that took my breath away. "Thank you," he whispered into my hair. "Thank you for bringing me here. Thank you for letting me see where our story began." I pulled back to look at him, at this man who had given me everything, who had transformed my life from a duty to be endured into a joy to be celebrated. "This is where I fell in love with you," I told him, "before I knew your face or your name or the sound of your voice. I fell in love with you in this cottage, reading your words by candlelight, dreaming of a man I thought I could never have." His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "And I fell in love with you from across a ballroom," he said. "But I did not know it was love until I began to write. Until I put words on paper and discovered that they were all about you. Until I realized that every thought in my head, every dream in my heart, led back to a woman with dark hair and a quiet smile who had disappeared into the crowd before I could learn her name. We both laughed then at the absurdity of it all, at the impossible chain of events that had brought us together. A woman who was not the woman he thought she was. A queen who answered letters addressed to a stranger. A duke who poured his heart into messages that should never have found their mark. "Fate is strange," I said. "Or perhaps there is no fate at all. Perhaps there is only chance and the courage to seize it when it presents itself." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window and the garden beyond. "Whatever it was," he said, "I am grateful for it, grateful beyond measure, because it gave me you." We spent the night at the cottage, sleeping in the same bed where I had lain awake so many nights, dreaming of a man whose face I did not know. But this time, I was not alone. This time, he was beside me, his warmth surrounding me, his heartbeat a steady rhythm against my back. In the morning before we departed, I took out a letter I had written the night before and slipped it beneath the loose floorboard, in the same spot where my farewell letter had once lain. It was a message to our younger selves, to the lonely woman and the searching man who had found each other through words and hope, and the willingness to believe in something beyond the visible world. "Dear Edward," I had written, using the name by which I had first known him. "If you are reading this, then you have found your way back to where it all began. I want you to know that every word I wrote to you was true, every confession, every dream, every declaration of feeling. I was afraid when I first answered your letter, afraid of what it might mean, afraid of where it might lead. But I am not afraid anymore, because the place it led was to you, and you are everything I never knew I needed. I am yours, now and always, in this cottage, in our palace, in whatever comes next. I am yours as I was from the moment I first read your words and felt my heart stir with recognition. We were strangers then, but we were never truly strangers. We were two halves of a single whole, waiting to find each other across the vast darkness of the world. Thank you for writing to me. Thank you for taking the risk. Thank you for not giving up, even when I tried to end our correspondence, even when I was too afraid to tell you the truth. Thank you for loving me. Forever and always, your S. I did not tell him about the letter. Some secrets are meant to be kept, small gifts hidden away for future discovery. Perhaps one day, years from now, someone will pull up that floorboard and find my words. Perhaps they will read them and wonder about the woman who wrote them, about the love that inspired them, about the story that began in this cottage and spread out to change the world. Or perhaps no one will ever find them. Perhaps they will remain hidden, a secret between me and the universe, a testament to a love that needed no audience, no validation, no recognition beyond the hearts of the two people who shared it. Either way, the words exist. The love exists. The story exists. And that is enough. The carriage ride home was different from the journey out. We talked the entire way, sharing memories and observations, laughing at old jokes and creating new ones. We held hands across the seat, our fingers intertwined as naturally as breathing. We watched the countryside roll past the windows, the fields and forests and villages that existed in peace because two people had chosen love over war. When we arrived at the palace, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. We stood on the steps and watched it sink below the horizon, another day ending, another chapter closing. But as the last light faded, I felt no sadness, only gratitude, only wonder, only the deep, abiding peace of a woman who has found her place in the world. He squeezed my hand and looked at me with those winter sea eyes that I have loved for so many years. "Shall we go in?" he asked. "There are letters waiting to be written." I smiled and let him lead me inside. "Yes," I said. "There are always letters waiting to be written, and I would not have it any other way." This, then, is truly the end of my account. The story of how a misdirected letter led to an unlikely correspondence, how an unlikely correspondence led to an impossible love, how an impossible love led to a lasting peace. It is a story of risk and reward, of fear and courage, of two people who found each other against all odds and chose to build something beautiful together. I hope, whoever you are, wherever you are, that you find your own letters, that you find the courage to write them and the faith to answer them, that you find, as I found, a love that transforms everything it touches. The letters led me home. And home, I have learned, is not a place. It is a person. It is the one who reads your words and understands them, the one who writes back and opens their heart, the one who stands beside you through darkness and light, through triumph and trial, through all the chapters of a life well lived. My home is him. My home has always been him, and my home will always be him for as long as love endures, which is to say, forever. The end.